Because they were staying.
I guess the original plug of the bag.
I haven't been over there and looked.
County were mustered in the Worsham, Prince Edward County Courthouse, that is. And with us tonight will be their commander, Chuck Ironmonger, on the left, who will be speaking to us and telling you a little bit about arms, accoutrements, the battles that the company engaged in. And then we'll go outside and take a look at a little campsite they got set up, or a tent at least, and some other arms and weapons, and they'll introduce some musket firing, so we'll have some fun. So, with no further ado, Chuck, turn it over to Company I.
Company. In place? In place. Rest. Good evening, folks. Appreciate you having us here this evening. As Bobby mentioned, we portray the 23rd Virginia Infantry Company I, Prince Edward Central Guards, that were mustered out of Prince Edward County. They were actually enlisted following an order from Robert E. Lee calling for 7 regiments of infantry to be mustered out of the south central counties of Virginia, along with 1 unit of cavalry and 4 units of artillery. The 23rd Virginia Company I mustered in on the 21st of May, 1861 at Worsham, at the courthouse of the time, and left the next day. And well, they enlisted on the 21st, and they were mustered in the next day, the 22nd, in Richmond. That's where they began their camp of instruction, their drill at Fort Lee, then the fairgrounds in Richmond. The 23rd was attached to Taliaferro's brigade, and they proceeded to West Virginia. They fought in the engagements in the early part of the war of 1861. By early 1862, they were brought back from the west. Originally, they were going to the Aquia district up in northern Virginia. General Johnston rescinded those orders and had the 23rd Regiment join Stonewall Jackson in the valley right prior to his valley campaign. So, of course, from that point, they were destined to follow Stonewall in his famous valley campaign and the ones that followed thereafter. They did take place in all the major engagements of the Stonewall Brigade, Sharpsburg. They were heavily engaged there, following being engaged at Harper's Ferry. There was Private Drury Lacey of Company I's, who had been from Prince Edward, who was commended for his actions during the battle that day on the 17th of September at Sharpsburg by Captain Bass, then commanding Company I. Private Lacey, during the numerous charges and counter-charges, at first had become detached from the 23rd and found himself with McLaw's division, where he continued to fight for a few hours until, after another long charge and counter-charge, he found himself with the Mississippi unit. He fought throughout the day and was mentioned in the reports for his bravery and his endurance and his sacrifice, and he later received a commission for that. Another member of Company I that you probably be familiar with would be Branch J, I believe his middle initial was, Worsham. He was the clerk of the court of Prince Edward County prior to the war. He did enlist and was mustered in with Company I the 23rd and soon became second lieutenant for the company. He was captured at the Battle of Carrick's Ford and was paroled 3 days later. He returned here at Prince Edward and resumed his duties as clerk of the court.
So, do you think that's why he didn't go back into service, was to honor his parole?
If he wasn't exchanged, he would be bound by his honor not to re-enter the service. But the information I have doesn't go into that detail, but that's very possible. If he failed to be exchanged, that's what happened to the Hampton boys. Company G, the 20th Virginia, they were captured early in the war, and McClellan held up they were paroled but not exchanged for well over a year. And McClellan did that purposefully because he wanted the young men to return to college. And as they were bound by their honor not to re-enter, join another unit and fight until they had actually been exchanged. And that did happen a little over a year following their capture. And most of them did join other units and continue to support the cause. At the surrender in Appomattox, the 23rd Virginia, well, let's see, Company I originally had 86 members, had mustered in. The total regimental force was a little over 1,000. And at Appomattox, they surrendered 6 officers, 1 surgeon, 49 infantrymen, 24 of whom were reported armed and fit for duty. Many of they were one of the first units that marched into Appomattox during the ceremony, surrendered, stacked their arms, hung their accoutrements on their arms. They surrendered a staff. I'm sure many of y'all have heard that a lot of the units didn't surrender their flag. They would either secret it into a coat jacket, or many times the units cut the flag into pieces, and each man had a piece of the battle flag for memento rather than surrender. The 23rd opted to cut their flag and share it among the men that were left.
So there's no idea really what it looked like?
Yes, and I actually should have brought it. I've got the actual flag is in the possession of the Museum of the Confederacy.
Square battle?
It's a square battle flag. In its current condition, there are numerous holes from battle and 2 rather large sections missing. Sorry, I should have brought
Did
this
it have like the battle places and all that?
Yes, they had 3 or 4. They were hand painted.
What about Gettysburg? Were they there?
Yes. They were at Gettysburg.
In biggest charge?
I'd have to look and see. I'd have to research that a little more.
Okay.
Yes,
You
ma'am.
said they cut it up, but I thought to distribute it, but so that they get it all back together again then?
That's a good question. I'm sure it didn't all come back together unless there was a photograph or something of the flag. But the Museum of the Confederacy does have it. That's unless they had more than one.
That's what I'm thinking. They probably had more than one.
Mhm.
One was captured.
Well,
and never got back.
each company would have had a flag.
Right.
So there must have been more than one.
Why don't you show us what some of these guys are wearing?
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the equipment. We'll start at the top with the hat gear. You see a variety of hats. We're sporting straw hats, real nice for the summer weather. It is authentic, not issued. A lot of the things that the soldiers would purchase from sutlers, which was like a mobile Walmart, if you will, where they'd follow the armies and they'd sell goods and so forth if the soldiers had funds to purchase them. So a lot of things that weren't issued, the soldiers could come across if they had the means. But the hats varied. In the early war, the kepi, or bummer hat was by and large the norm. Corporal Queen can demonstrate why it's named the forage cap. If you were camped and the lady down the road had a hen house, made a pretty good egg basket, or foraging for fruit or nuts or what have you. So that's the nickname, is the forage cap. It is modeled after the French kepi. Thank you, Corporal. As the war progressed, the men found that the brim cap was much more suitable, protect you from the elements, the rain and the sun and so forth, and by and large, most of the Confederates were wearing some sort of brimmed hat by the end of the war. The shell jackets that we're all wearing are usually either a 7 or 9 button front. The jackets would be issued with block I for infantry buttons. The buttons were either block I, block A for artillery, or C for cavalry. The first opportunity the men had, they would cut these buttons off and replace them with buttons from their state. They were very proud of the state that they hailed from, whether it was Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, but they would replace the buttons to indicate the state that they hailed from. The trousers varied. Kersey blue, such as Private Harris is wearing here, is a color that was issued by both armies. The gray, of course, would have been a Confederate color, especially later in the war. Which y'all know that in the beginning of the war, a lot of the Yankees had gray uniforms, and a lot of the Confederates had blue, but as things settled out and as the war progressed, by and large, the Confederacy wore gray and the Union wore the blue. The trousers would have been, when the means were available, would have been issued by the Confederate government. The pants that I have on would have been probably civilian. The color, brown or butternut, came from walnut hulls. The dye was made from walnut hulls. So you'll see some butternut clothing is almost a chocolate brown and some of it's lighter. It just depends on how the dye mix was put together. The shoes were a brogan boot. We have an example of them, easier to show you outside when we move outside, but it was a 3/4 boot. In the Confederate Army, they were straights. There were no lefts or rights, they were all straights. And if you wore out a shoe in the Confederate Army, you were issued a shoe due to the lack of materials. Some of the equipment that the men are carrying, let's see. Private Fallen is sporting a wooden canteen. These were very desirable due to the fact that the tin canteens that the rest of us are carrying, the water would rust and not taste so good. But a wooden canteen, the water would taste pretty fine. Corporal Queen has got just a tin canteen. You can see that it's smooth. This was a Confederate issue. My canteen, which you can't see as well, but it does have ribs or ridges. This would have been a Union manufacturer. This was much more desirable because it could take a hit. If you fell on it or it hit a rock or whatever, it could withstand that much easier than the smooth canteen. So if you had a chance to pick up one of these on the battlefield, you would. I'm carrying a duck grill haversack. Thousands of these were left over from the Mexican War and the armies in the South and were distributed to the Confederate soldiers early in the war. But much more desirable would be a tarred haversack, such as Corporal Queen is wearing. Desirable because usually the haversack is where you kept your food, maybe letters from home, and of course it being waterproof would keep your items dry and would be much preferable, and would probably be gleaned from the battlefield. Corporal Queen is also sporting the ever-present Bowie knife. The Confederate soldiers, most every soldier carried one. They weren't actually used as arms, but more for culinary purposes while in camp. But you do see a lot of pictures of the soldiers that carried that. Let's see. The cap box, small pouch on the front, carried the caps. We'll demonstrate that in a little while. What was used to fire the musket. A little brass cap with a drop of mercury fomate inside caused the spark to ignite the powder. The cartridge box carried the ammunition. Usually the Confederates were issued 40 rounds at a time. Okay. Who's missing, gentlemen? Bayonet. Most of this, as you see, are, okay, well, I'll start with the musket then. I'm carrying a 3-banded Enfield rifled musket. It's 58 caliber, manufactured in London, England. Approximately 350,000 of these made it through the blockade during the war and found their way to the Confederate Army. Of course, as Jeff Davis's government was buying them from England, Lincoln began to buy them as well, just to drive the market up, so to speak. They had plenty of arms being manufactured in the North for the Union Army, but he wanted to prevent the Southern Army from making the purchase, so he began to buy them as well. Corporal Queen is carrying a 2-banded Zouave, and he can tell you a little bit about that.
This is a Zouave 2-banded rifle. Used primarily by Confederates and also Zouave regiments. Primary examples of these regiments would have been the Louisiana Tigers or the New York Fire Zouaves, and they were called Fire Zouaves because of the red uniform and leggings that they carry. It was accurate. They say up to 1,000 yards, well, probably it was more like 500. It was more desirable because of the fact that it was shorter, less weight. The cavalry liked it because it was shorter and easier to load on horseback.
Now, what type of bayonet is that?
This is a saber bayonet. It takes its name because of its saber-like appearance. It could also be used, and as you see, it has a handle. It could be used for hand-to-hand if necessary.
And it's longer to compensate for the shortness of the
I
barrel?
think so. I'm not real sure about that. I would think it does come out about right.
Is musket shorter, but the overall length is about the same.
They were used a lot by file closers in the infantry, and they would have a flag on the end. The NCOs on the end of the line that were used to dress the lines, a lot of times would have a small flag on the end of their saber bayonet. You see the other muskets are fixed with a triangular bayonet. And are we all carrying Enfields?
Richmond.
Okay, you want to tell them a little bit about that?
This is a Richmond musket manufactured in Richmond. It is a copy, basically, of a U.S. Springfield. After the Confederacy captured the machinery at Harper's Ferry, it was moved to Richmond, and we started manufacturing our own muskets. The main difference between this and Springfield is the brass butt plate and the brass cap here on the end of the stock right there. But otherwise, it's a very close copy, except it's got CS Richmond on it. Very desirable. And again, if you can see it, the configuration, three-pointed bayonet, three-sided bayonet. And I've heard these were outlawed in later conflicts because a puncture wound with three sides will not heal up.
Outlawed by whom?
I don't know any details on that, but I understand that's why they were not used in later years.
Kind of like the sawtooth bayonet in World War I. You were issued them, but if you were captured with one, they would use it on you, was kind of the thing. You throw it away and take out a regular
I'm not
bayonet.
sure, man, that's what I've heard.
What are you carrying?
I'm carrying a U.S. Springfield rifle musket. This was made in Springfield, Massachusetts, and over 250,000 of them were produced from the correct owner. And both sides favored the weapon. And as you can see, they made the Richmond pattern on the same gun.
One thing I hadn't mentioned was the belt buckle. By and large, most of the Confederates used the fork-tongue belt buckle. You can see where it gets its name. You do see some other plates, but most of the time you'll see the fork-tongue belt plate. Corporal Wooten, why don't you let Private Fallon hold your musket? And, it's got a blanket roll here. Early in the war, there were a lot of packs were issued, but later in the war, of course, there again, the materials not being available and weight always being a factor on a long march, you would have your blanket roll, and if you had a clean shirt or sometimes letters from home would be rolled up inside, so it would be kind of take the place of your pack, knapsack, and then also you had your, of course, your blanket there. And a lot of times, if you were fortunate enough, you might also have a gum blanket to roll with that. It always amazes me to find out what they did have back then, and as well sometimes what they didn't have. But they did have vulcanized rubber. They had learned how to make rubber stick to canvas. And so this could be used as a ground cloth. The ground was wet, you could lay down on the ground, or if it was raining, you could put it over you. It has grommets in it, a piece of rawhide, and put it over your shoulders and use it for a poncho. It's a pretty versatile piece of equipment to have. If the men were ahead of the wagons on the march, which was most of the time the case, this is all they have with them. It would be their blanket roll. They wouldn't have the items that might be in their camp box or whatever. If the weather was cold, A lot of times the men would bunk together. You take one man's gum blanket and lay on the ground, and then another blanket on top, and then the two men would lay down spoon fashion and cover up with the second man's blanket and gum blanket. And then a lot of times if the weather was, of course, unbearably cold, they would be able to sustain each other that way. Are there any questions up to this point on the equipment?
I noticed one thing when it was unrolling it here, it looks like it has a split in it so you can wear it over you for.
Yes, ma'am. That's correct. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly right. Of course, overcoats, we don't have an example of one tonight, but they would be very desirable in winter weather, but if not, then, you know, a hole in the blanket would help knock the wind off. And that has knocked the wind off many a night. We have some items up here. I don't know how well you can see from where you are. Hold some of them up. Hardtack was a main issue as far as foodstuffs for both armies. See where it gets its name. And this one is rather wormy looking and is probably very authentic. It may even be original. They would take this hard cracker, and if they had a little piece of fat back or something, they would fry that in a frying pan and then break this up in the pan and try to soften it and give it some flavor and so forth. They had 2 or 3 ways to prepare these to try to make them a little more palatable. These little sacks, they call them poke bags, and you could separate your foodstuffs in it, grits, sugar, coffee. You see this one has coffee in it. Here again, it kind of amazes me what they had. Lemonade mix, powdered lemonade mix, chocolate bar. These are reproductions, of course, but pretty interesting. Condensed milk in a can. They had actually started canning some foodstuffs. They canned meat as well. Matches, box of matches. These are replicas. Barley twist tobacco, we're all familiar with that. And this was used a lot for trade between the armies. Many times they'd be encamped, especially over the winter months, they might be encamped across the river from each other for long periods of time, and there's stories where they'd make little boats, and the Confederates always had tobacco, but they were always short of newspapers and coffee. And so they would trade back and forth with the Union soldiers. Comb, wooden comb. Most of the soldiers would have had their Bible or Testament with them, small hymn book. Great revival swept through the Confederate Army during the war, and a large percentage of Confederate soldiers following the war went into the ministry. The 18th Virginia Company G Nottoway Grays, I think almost 50% of their surviving members went into the ministry following the war.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Well, I guess if you're only 6 out of 111 men in the company to get unscathed in
Right.
Gettysburg.
Yeah, I guess that could have something to do with it, but I think their faith got them through their trials. Got 2 examples here of sewing kits. This is just a leather pouch. This is an item like they would have carried in their haversack, probably tied it with a piece of rawhide string. Has the needles here, and the pouch, of course, holds the button and thread. Another style that was very prominent is made out of a deer antler. It has a hole drilled in the end, with a cap, and that's where you keep your needles. And then just a ridge carved here to hold the thread. They referred to these as housewives. They had to do their own sewing out in the field. I'm sorry, I was thinking these boots were outside, but I wanted to show you, and pass this around if you like. But these shoes were put together with wooden pegs. That's a good example. You can imagine how hard that would be to break in left or right, being a straight shoe like it is. This is a reproduction bugle of the period. Tin plate. If the men were lucky enough to have one, this is what they take their meals out of. It's an example of knife and fork that they would have had, which that fork looks pretty lethal in itself. Also, the canteens, the tin canteens were in two halves that were soldered together, and if they needed a plate, they could put, if they had an extra canteen or an old canteen, put it in the fire and melt the lead, and they'd use a half a canteen for a plate. Tin cup, pretty heavy. This one could probably be used to cook over the fire. Reproduction compass. Early in the war, a lot of the men and men in the, under arms and civilians at home wore what was called secession ribbons to show their support for secession and for the new country. Of course, there are many varieties of these, but this is just one example. Just a blue ribbon with a Virginia button in the center. This is most of these things are reproduction. These are actually original field glasses of the period. And I'll go ahead and mention, in case you didn't notice, how ragtag we do look. That's because we portray a late war unit as opposed to an early war unit. When the men marched off at the beginning of the war, they, of course, the uniforms all matched, and they were all pretty in their handkerchiefs and white leggings and gloves and so forth. But as the war went on, these things wore out and they weren't able to be replaced. And as I mentioned earlier, weight was always issued on a march. You wanted to travel as light as you could. Towards the end of the war, a lot of the Confederates didn't even carry their cartridge box anymore. They'd be issued their 40 rounds, put them in their pocket. If they were in camp and getting ready to march out to battle, they'd be issued 3 days rations. Rather than carry it, they'd cook it and eat it. Some of us have made long marches, and you find yourself trying to shed all the weight you can. Are there any questions?
Do they all carry the toothbrush?
Was very prominent to carry a toothbrush in either in a buttonhole or in the hat. One of the dentists was very painful, and they did try to take good care of their teeth if they didn't do anything else. And one other thing they have up here is a can of tooth powder, reproduction tooth powder, which I assume is kind of along the lines of baking soda, I would think. This is the mini ball, 58 caliber that all these weapons fire. We'll pass that around. You'll see that's a pretty good sized piece of lead. And of course, the men spent more time in camp than they did in battle, and bored to tears most of the time. So they would make things. You find those mini balls carved. Some people have collections of carved mini balls. This is a dog tag, homemade dog tag, that's made out of the mini ball just like that, just mashed flat. And of course, if you had a chain, put a hole in it, put it on a chain, or if not, just carry it as a coin in your pocket. They would scratch their name and their unit and keep it with them in hopes that if they did fall in battle, that their body would be able to be identified and returned home to their loved ones.
Was all the mini balls 58 caliber?
Not all, no. They quite a variety actually. Some of these gentlemen may be able to offer more information than I, but 69 caliber is the largest I've heard.
What is it? We've got some at home that's gray, and what are they? You don't have no idea?
I'm sorry.
They're gray shit color.
No, the color really wouldn't matter. If it's a dug mini ball, certain types of soil would turn the lead different colors, depending on what type of soil it was found. But they would have all been lead. So originally they would have all been gray. And I guess the smallest caliber would be, what, 32? Something like that. And I've heard it said that a gentleman didn't carry a pistol larger than a 38. General Lee carried a 38 caliber.
I haven't either.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that kept on loose leaf paper, or did they have some type of bound notebook or bound?
They had bound books. I'm sure it was either or both. Sharon Goad, who is the head librarian at Hampton Sydney right now, has a tube journal, diary from a Confederate cavalry soldier that was from Crewe. And the first journal, well, I say journal, it's a book about this size, and probably about a half-inch thick, blank pages that he filled out, and then he had one almost identical that he'd started, and then it goes halfway and stops because he was killed at that. And she is currently editing that and rewriting it for publication. Paper was hard to come by, especially for soldiers in the field, so I would imagine that you would have had to been maybe someone of means that your family could have sent that to you. Of course, a lot of the soldiers had items sent from home because the government simply couldn't supply clothing, pants, shirts. You read a lot of the diaries where the soldiers are writing home and asking their wife or their mother or their girlfriend to send this or that piece of article of clothing or what have you that they just couldn't obtain in the field.
I stayed in the United States Army for a year and a half before they ever reached me a pair of shoes.
Is that
In
right?
1939, they didn't have. And so that isn't anything new.
So you wore your own? You wore your own shoes?
Wore my own shoes.
Is that right?
They were totally unprepared in 1939. I wouldn't want to belittle my reputation by telling me how naked we were. I don't mean physically.
Right.
I'm talking about the country. Congress would not appropriate any money. But I had to know as per law is everything you want.
Yeah.
Would you volunteer?
Yeah, I went with the Virginia National College. Before we started the draft, because I thought that was the proper thing to do, and it turned out it was. I'm here.
There you go.
We're glad of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm taking
Am I leaving anything out, gentlemen? Can you think of anything? The soldiers, our hats aren't really decorated, but the soldiers would also decorate their hats with numbers of their regiment, maybe a state button if they had an extra one on their hat. They would sometimes decorate. Oh, you do have.
If I could add to that, my headquarters blue, which would signify infantry. The artillery would have red decorations, and the cavalry would have yellow. You could look at the soldier and tell which branch he was with.
it still use the same thing now.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Uniform?
If I could,
Yes, sir.
If I could back way up and add to the question about the flag.
Absolutely.
My ancestors was with the 18th Virginia Company D of Prospect, and their battle flag was captured during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and that flag is on display in the Business Center at Gettysburg. But then they were issued another one, which was captured at Sailor's Creek, so that could explain two or maybe more flags for the same regiment.
Very good. See, I'm learning something too. Great. Well, folks, if, of course, we can address any questions you have at any time, but we'll go ahead and move outside and we'll demonstrate how the rifle musket was loaded and fired. And also we have an example, as Bobby mentioned earlier, of a tent, kind of a mini encampment. So this one, move on up. Attention.
Attention.
Company. Headed trail.
At the trail,
My files left.
by files left.
Mark. All right. In place.
In place.
Red. All right, folks. This is a typical tent, A-frame tent. that would have been issued to the infantry. One thing I'd like to mention is a typical company size would be about 100 men. And as I mentioned, Company I, the Central Guards, started out in strength of about 86. So you have to use your imagination a little bit. The tents would be set up in what was called a company street. So you'd have one tent there and one tent about where Chaplain Wooten is standing, facing each other, about 25 long. And the company officers' tents would be at the end of the street, facing the center of the street. This is where they'd have their fires and do their cooking and that kind of thing. They'd set that tent on top of it. That'd give them more headroom. They'd go into winter quarters. They'd be there for 2 or 3 months possibly. They would actually have little stoves and build mud chimneys on the back and set up desks and kind of make it like home when they were going to be there for a while. So that's an example of what the men lived in and slept in when they were in camp. Next thing we want to demonstrate for you is a drill that was used on raw recruits that was used to teach the raw recruits how to load and fire the rifled musket. Attention!
Attention!
Company! Shoulder!
Shoulder!
On! Load in 10 times.
Load in 10 times.
Load. At this time, the soldiers would bring the musket down by the side and touch their cartridge box. Handle. Cartridge. They take the cartridge out and put it to their teeth. Now, remember the lead ball that we passed around inside would be fastened to some form of paper tube that held the black powder inside. So what they're doing now is simulating biting that lead ball in their teeth. You had to have good teeth to be in the Army. Tear, cartridge. They tear the paper off the ball and continue to hold the ball in their teeth and put the cartridge to the muzzle. Charge, cartridge. This time they'd pour the powder into the muzzle. It'd fall to the breech. Put their pinky on the ramrod. Draw, rammer. Pull the ramrod halfway out, or pull all the way out and halfway down and get ready to ram the ball. Ram, cartridge. This would drive the ball to the breech of the musket on top of the powder. Return, rammer. Bring the rammer out, spin it, and they end up with their pinky on the ramrod waiting for the next command. Cast, about. They get in position, and this is when they would take the cap, prime. They take the cap with the mercury fomate in the end and put it on the nipple of the musket here. And when the hammer hit the cap, that's what caused the spark that ignited the powder and drove the ball and fired the musket. Order.
Order.
On. Now I'm going to load separately because I have a hard time talking and doing. There was a variety of different types of firing that was used by the infantry. And there again, indulge me with your imagination and picture a minimum of 100 men lined up here in 2 ranks, front rank, rear rank. If your enemy was way down there by Southern States, you might want to put a lot of firepower out there because there was no chance that they would rush you before you could reload. So then you would fire by company. Every man in the company fire at one time. Now if they were a little closer and you thought there was a chance that they could come upon you before you were reloaded, you could fire part of the men. One type of fire was fire by files from the right. The front rank man and the rear rank man make up a file. Okay. So we would fire together, and as soon as we had fired, the next 2 would fire, and so forth down the line. The idea being that by the time the last man on that end had fired, we are reloaded. and we're ready to shoot again. The other type would be fire by rank, front rank and rear rank. You'd fire your front rank men, your rear rank men would hold until they were reloaded, and then you could fire your rear rank. We're going to demonstrate fire by company. Y'all are okay, we're going to go to the left oblique. Shoulder, shoulder, on. Fire by company. Fire by company. Ready. Aim at the left oblique. Fire. Load. At the command load, the men would simply load and fire as quickly as possible. The demonstration that we showed you a few minutes ago was used for training purposes only. A seasoned veteran during the war could load and fire this weapon 3 times a minute.
Smoke disappeared.
Company, aim! Fire! Load!
Here comes the game warden. They like to shoot, they're just like boys.
Oh, I can see now. I couldn't see for a long time.
Oh boy, that was bad.
At the left oblique. Aim! Aim! Fire! Shoulder! Shoulder! On! Present! Present! On! Shoulder! Shoulder! On! Order! Order! On! In place! In place! Rest! Folks, that pretty much concludes our demonstration. Do you have any questions? Anything come to mind? Anybody want to fire a musket?
Oh, kids, ladies. You know you want to do this.
There's no kick. It's too heavy to kick. We can take the bayonets off. The weapon weighs 12 pounds with the bayonet fixed. We can take the bayonet off and lighten it a little bit. They're so heavy they don't kick.
Was that always affixed? Did they remove it at any point, or was it always?
It's my understanding they were always fixed in battle. They say Jackson's actually would rust to the barrels. They stayed fixed so often because he was usually ready for a charge if need be. He would go that extra mile. Chaplain, you go stomp him down. Thank you, sir. Jimmy Wooten is our chaplain. He serves us with prayer. We're glad he could join us tonight.
When they're fighting, did you set the woods on fire like that?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Quite often. Actually, the Battle of the Wilderness, for the time of the year it was, and the amount of men that were in the woods at that time, there were numerous fires, and many of the wounded could not escape the fire and did burn to death. They were just no way to help them. And it was such a thick mass. The troops were lost themselves. Yes, ma'am.
Did everybody in the same group use the same caliber? Like did everybody in the same group use 58s or?
If possible, I'm sure there were exceptions, but of course it would make it easier to resupply the men if they were using one type of ammunition. So by and large, I would say yes. There's probably more variety in the cavalry units. They would carry a variety of pistols, shotguns. Like Daniel was saying, the two-banded short rifled musket. So that there was much more variation in the cavalry units. The artillery would usually carry a pistol or a short broadsword.
Was the chaplain armed at all?
I've never seen a chaplain armed, but there were chaplains who were officers that were armed, that were actually commanding infantry. But I can't say definitively one way or the other. I'm sure there's exceptions to everything. And early in the war, early in the war, a lot of privates and infantrymen would carry their sidearms, but it just didn't take long for them to find that, first of all, it wasn't necessary because you were supposed to be firing with the rest of the men, and the other thing was always the weight factor. I'm not toting this anymore, I'm sending it home. But it really was of no use to the infantry soldier. Now, the only exception there would be the officers, some NCOs, and the color guard. A lot of times the color guard didn't carry muskets, they might carry sidearms.
So, to conclude, can you tell us about the ceremony to take part in Memorial Day?
Thank you. Most of you folks know, but for those of you who don't, and I'm going to take the liberty of inviting everybody, to the United Daughters of the Confederacy Farmville Chapter's annual Memorial Day service at the Confederate Cemetery to take place this Monday at 11 a.m. It begins at 11 a.m. It lasts about 30 minutes. Lunch following at Cedar Brook. We've got a nice program planned this year. We've got a very good speaker, I understand, from Appomattox. He has spoken to the Sons of Confederate Veteran Camp here in Farmville and was very well received. And actually, I missed that night, but the comments were he was the best we'd had. In 10 years, that's saying a lot. So he's the keynote speaker. Many of you know Keita Watson. She'll be singing a ballad from the war. We'll have a poem read. 23rd Virginia will be there to serve as an honor guard, and we'd love to see everyone there. Okay? It's a nice ceremony. It's been growing every year. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Was it inside with you? Did he not have a weapon?
No, he's our chaplain.
Oh, okay.
So that's Chaplain Wooten, and he was guarding the camp while we were inside.
Okay. So he would have never had a weapon.
I've never seen a chaplain carry a weapon.
And did he stand up in line with everybody?
No, he'd probably be in camp, back in camp or behind the lines.
Yeah, what's his name?
Robert Harris.
Now there were chaplains who were officers.
It was his people.
Officers of the line, and they would have carried weapons.
If I was in that line, I'd think.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You talking about up on Cumberland, you talking about?
Yes, sir.
I cleaned the town. I worked for the town back in the 60s. I cleaned it up there.
Oh, great. Well,
I was working for the town when we cleaned it up.
All right. Thank you.
I mean, it was a mess.
Yeah, I'll bet it was.
Yeah.
Have you ever been out to the ceremony?
Mm-mm.
You ought to come out. Didn't last long. About 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm. But I was working for the town when we cleaned it up, and
Okay.
there were snakes and everything else when we cleaned that thing
right?
up. Dead trees, and so the old fence and everything then.
Okay. Where the concrete pieces are?
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Interesting. Well, y'all are welcome to take a closer look at the tin or whatever.
Okay. Chuck, we thank y'all.
Yes, sir. Very much, sir.
Thank you. No, they still have them.
Rick, Rick,
And you change the picture. Is that in there anywhere?